Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Hi, I'm David Naiman, the host of the radio show and podcast Between the Covers. People are often surprised to learn that this is not my day job, that I don't get paid. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm not here to ask you for an income. Up until now, hosting the podcast has involved only nominal fees, but the podcast has seen explosive growth this year. Listenership has quadrupled in less than 10 months, and these once nominal fees have grown to many hundreds of dollars, which could easily become thousands next year and which I'm paying myself. So I'm here today talking to you in the hope of creating a sustainable model for me to nurture the podcast's success. If you value these interviews, whether with great fiction writers such as George Saunders, Laurie Moore, or Junot Diaz, science fiction icons Ursula K. Le Guin, William Gibson, and Neil Stephenson, or genre-bending essayists and poets such as Claudia Rankine, Maggie Nelson, and Mary Ruefle, I hope you'll become a patron of Between the Covers. Your per-episode contribution would be your way to participate in the show's long-term health. Please take a moment and either go to Patreon, patreon.com/betweenthecovers, or to davidnaiman.com/support. And give your support, and enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest, the writer Alexis M. Smith, was born and raised here in the Pacific Northwest. Her debut novel, Glaciers, was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award and is still one of the most popular titles put out by Tin House Books. Alexis Smith is here today on Between the Covers, 4 years after our first conversation, to discuss her much-anticipated follow-up to Glaciers, Marrow Island, out from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Whereas Glaciers was often described as quiet, spare, and introspective, Marrow Island has been called a literary page-turner, an ecological thriller, and a post-earthquake mystery. Library Journal calls it a near-perfect read. Kirkus calls it a stunning work of eco-fiction, and Publishers Weekly, in its starred review, says that Smith's story carries the same heft, descriptive nuance, and narrative spark that distinguished her debut, but this time, she more finely hones her character's emotional rhythm and atmospheric location to create a thoroughly eerie reading experience, capped off with a startling conclusion. Welcome back to Between the Covers, Alexis M. Smith.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So before we talk about the story of Marrow Island, I thought maybe we could orient our listeners to the situation of the story. One of the most talked about articles of the last year was the New Yorker article by Catherine Schultz, the big one, which won the Pulitzer Prize, which describes the utterly catastrophic earthquake that we're due for in the Northwest, and which we're completely unprepared for, probably partially because we don't really have an earthquake culture. They don't happen on that level like they do in Japan and California very often. So in Marrow Island, this earthquake has already happened 20 years ago.
Right.
So tell us what the world is like now. The earthquake has happened. What has happened to the region, and what has the region done since the earthquake?
Right. Well, I obviously wrote the book before Catherine's article came out. So I was imagining an earthquake that wasn't maybe necessarily as catastrophic as she describes. And she describes sort of a worst case scenario, which is really what got everyone so alarmed, I think, and interested in the article. I did a lot of the same kinds of research that she did, excepting I didn't have a budget to go out on boats with geologists and things like that and actually see the physical evidence. But I imagined it was a big earthquake, and big enough to cause sort of man-made disasters post-earthquake. And these are the kind of things that happen when you don't have preparations for infrastructure and just homeowners. And so I imagined this up in Puget Sound, and Puget Sound is a basin, as you know, and there are lots of islands. And I imagined what happened on, largely what happens in the Sound, and then also what happens specifically on a couple of islands in the San Juans, where in my telling, in my story, there is a petroleum refinery on one of the islands, and the earthquake and the subsequent waves that come through the Sound devastate those islands by causing chemical spills and whatnot.
So you make an interesting choice time-wise,
Yeah.
in the sense that maybe the most obvious choice would be to put the earthquake in the future.
Right.
And you've imagined the earthquake happened in the real historical record in the 90s,
Right.
so 20 years ago, and that the book takes place then in an alternate present instead of an alternate or imagined future. What were
Right.
you hoping to achieve, or what did that give you to shift the timeline that way so that we recognize the world in some respects? Like the technology is going to all be recognizable to us because it's the present tense, but it is an
Right.
alternate present tense because the history for the last 20 years is different.
Right. The first reason why I didn't write it in the future is that I don't feel like a science fiction writer. I feel like there are great science fiction writers out there whose imaginations really go into the future in that way. And I really wanted to just talk about what disasters have been like and what they will continue to be like if we don't change our ways. And even if we do change our ways, I mean, many of the climate-based disasters are sort of set in motion already. But so going back in time and imagining a disaster like this was really just a way for me to comment on my feelings that we, despite having witnessed these things happening elsewhere in the world, have not come to grips with it here. And how would the world be different if we had already had that earthquake? And I think probably not very much. I think we would still be facing a lot of the same crises here that we are facing right now. And I think that was just, part of it was also I just wanted to explore the idea that we lived through it. Some of us lived through it. I think just to work out my own personal anxiety about the impending earthquake. And, so that was more the personal agenda that I had. But it was really interesting when I pitched this book, or my agent pitched this book to editors. I had a sort of slew of conversations with editors after they had read the first 100 pages or so. And not all of them, but at least a handful of them had to check with me to make sure that this earthquake hadn't actually happened. They weren't sure. And that sort of told me that this is the way disasters happen, and what I suspected was true, and that things like Katrina happen, and then they sort of dissolve into the common memory of horrible things happening environmentally around us, and then we're not really quite sure if something like this actually did happen.
Yeah.
And there was an earthquake in the Nisqually Basin, 15 years ago or so, and that was somewhat what I based the idea on. Was I was here in Portland, but most of my family was still in Seattle, and we felt it here. I remember the day really vividly. And, so there's this sense of like, oh, did this happen? It may have happened, actually, but especially for people who lived across the country, and they maybe are not as connected. And, of course, at that point, the Schultz article hadn't come out yet, so it wasn't in the broader imagination of this idea of the Cascadia subduction zone.
Yeah. Well, one of the things it did for me emotionally to have it not be a looming disaster, but an already happened disaster was interesting, because I remember when you were here talking about glaciers, which shares some of the same concerns around climate change and environmental destruction. That book feels more elegiac. It's feels a little bit more like it's mourning a world that's slipping away, and we're not going to be able to stop this from happening. The glaciers are going to disappear.
Right.
And in this book, because the catastrophe isn't looming but behind us, it feels like it shifts the focus emotionally towards, I don't know if I want to say the word hope, but towards what do we do now?
Yeah.
Because, and I remember when you were talking about glaciers, you said that the first drafts of that book were very despairing, and then you had your child, and you shifted the focus to hope more. But it feels, because of the placement of the earthquake, it feels like it's even shifted more in Marrow Island. Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. But I think that it was a little bit selfish of me to set the earthquake in the past. Like at times I wondered if I wasn't risking enough, just as a writer, to push myself into the future and imagine a future where this happens. Say, imagine the actual event unfolding at some point in my lifetime. But I will say that it really did help me come to terms with that anxiety, and maybe imagine scenarios in which people I know, or types of people that I know, will be able to sort of rally afterwards.
I had sort of like a double question around it, because given that we've talked before, 4 years ago, and your first book came out maybe 5 years ago, and in that interim, we've continued to be at war, and the country as a whole and the globe as a global community hasn't come to grips in any meaningful way around climate change. So if you were to look at our species 5 years later, you wouldn't have hope that we were solving the solution, solving the problem.
Hope is not necessarily the word that I would use for Marrow Island or for my mindset when I was writing it.
But I guess what my question was around it was, is it harder as these things continue to write something that's about, well, what do we do? Or does it feel even more important and more vital, and you feel more compelled to, because things aren't getting better?
I definitely think so. I don't think every writer has to write about, what's wrong, whether it's the environment or social justice or racism or homophobia or war in general. I don't think everyone should. I don't think everyone's art should be involved with those big questions. But I don't know any other way. I don't know any other way. I write things to work through them, or imagine my way through them in some regard, and also because I have a lot of empathy. Not that other writers don't have empathy, but I have a lot of feelings. I feel a lot of feelings, and if I have a way to help others feel feelings around those issues, I don't need to give them answers or even give myself answers. It's just, it's sort of, it's a community building kind of thing, or a, if the broader imagination is working on what we do, then perhaps maybe there's hope then.
Yeah. In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Alexis M. Smith about her latest book, Marrow Island. Well, let's talk a little bit about the protagonist. Well, Marrow Island, in a way, is an important character, both emotionally and geographically in the book. And you mentioned that during the earthquake, an oil refinery explosion happens. Right. And that oil refinery explosion and then the attempts to put out the fire make Marrow Island uninhabitable. And yet this was also a big trauma for our protagonist, because her father worked there and died in the explosion. So tell us a little bit about Lucy Bowen, what she's been up to, because she's sort of abandoned, like Marrow Island has been abandoned as contaminated. She's sort of abandoned her past, and she lives on the mainland now. What has she been up to, and what are her concerns?
Well, she hasn't abandoned it, I guess. She's become an environmental journalist, working in Seattle. She and her mother sort of escaped the islands to Seattle at some point after the quake, when it was possible. So she went to school and grew up without her father, and her mother remarried, and she remarried a developer, a real estate developer. And Lucy herself is sort of she's lost her steady work as a journalist and is sort of floundering, isn't really sure what to do, isn't sure she can make it as a freelancer, and her mother has also given her the keys to this cottage that they lived in, a family cottage they lived in on an adjacent island to Marrow Island. And so she just sort of, in desperation, and also probably in some desire to reconnect with where maybe her career started, was being involved in this disaster, she goes back home to the islands, and after 20-something years, and she's there, and her best friend is also there and has sort of summoned her in a way, and so there's also a reckoning there.
The post-earthquake Seattle that you picked sort of reminds me of the Portland of now, in the sense that it feels like the earthquake was an excuse for a sort of a Wild West of development against the common good, potentially. Right. So wild free-for-all of capitalist development in Seattle post-earthquake.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's part of what I was saying about imagining where we would be 20 years after an earthquake, and I think probably not in a very different place. It seems like after the housing crisis, it seems like Wall Street and other, moneyed investors came in and started grabbing up houses and property, and now we have this rental crisis and this housing crisis in a lot of cities, and I imagined that after a big disaster like that, there would be a lot of desperate people who couldn't afford to fix their houses, that couldn't be lived in, and that a similar thing might happen.
Probably my favorite parts of the book are what happens when Lucy's best friend and summon her to Marrow Island, because unbeknownst to the world, there's a colony that has been set up on the island, and I love being with this colony, and the rituals that you invented. And I'm curious about if you could, first of all, maybe describe some of these rituals, the work prayer and some of the other things that are going on in the colony and the purpose of it. But also I'm curious about your familiarity with intentional communities, or the research you did around intentional communities.
I actually didn't do a lot of research on intentional communities, and intentionally, I avoided other novels that were, based on communes or cults or anything like that. Just because I kind of wanted to come at it from my own gut. Like it's sort of, the colony is. It's started and run by this woman, Sister J, who was a nun and left because she felt called to minister to the earth, and she was being maybe fenced in by her obligations to the church, and she's a very spiritual woman, but and there are spiritual aspects to everything they do at the colony. But it's less God-oriented and more earth-oriented. There's a bit of a matriarchy kind of going on there, with Sister J at the head and women in powerful positions. And there are men there as well. And one of the things they do is work prayer, which is the first thing in the morning. They get up and they each have a chore around the farm, or preparing food, or fishing, or all of the different workings of the colony. Everyone has a chore in the morning, and they go silently and they do their work. And as they do their work, they are in touch with the island and in touch with being humans in space and working together. And that's I think the work prayer was the first thing that came to me, partly because I find it myself to be kind of I was attracted to the idea, I guess, of living amongst people who all have a kind of peaceful aspect and want to sort of wake up every morning with this goal in mind of all surviving together by each doing his or her part. I find that really, that idea, it's idealistic. It's, it can't happen in a very large group of people, because everyone has different goals and intentions, but there are only, I think, I forget now because I wrote it so long ago, there are about 50 of them, 40 of them or something so on the island. and it's a small enough group that they are able to do this together. And does that give you
No, that's
sense?
great. That's great. And I mean, when we're here, we're talking about like the collapse of publishing and the capitalism run amok, and this island is really trying to create an alternate society, but also a society that's trying to reclaim contaminated land.
Yes,
so they're engaged. They're not like ignoring the world of that's in peril, but actually actively trying to engage with the imperiled world at the same time.
Right. Yeah. It's that is their entire goal. It's to go somewhere that needed them the most, which was this place that they had access to, which was the most important thing, but also that needed them. It needed someone to address what had happened and redress it. And they are working together with scientists and students and the sort of like young idealistic activist types and herbalists and, just a variety of people who maybe are not called for religious reasons, but are called just for a fundamental connection to the earth kind of reasons.
And using all sorts of like gray water systems and solar technology.
Right. And I did do quite a bit of research on that, even though it really only comes in at the periphery of the story. It's not necessarily important to the plot, but yeah, there's a lot of research around that, and that did make me a little hopeful, sort of knowing what kind of technology is out there and what's possible.
Well, I wanted to ask you something about the imagining of the Marrow colony in relationship to our region, the Pacific Northwest, because it seems like the Northwest, at least in my mind, it seems like it attracts utopian inspirations or communities of all sorts, running the gamut ideologically. So the dream of Cascadia, of a sort of a autonomous region from Northern California to British Columbia, but also like the Rajneesh compound in Oregon. And even on the right-wing side of things, you could look at the Malheur occupation as a right-wing utopian fever dream of some sort.
Sure.
But do you think there's something about like the Pacific Northwest ethos or history, cultural history, that attracts these sorts of parallel communities or alternate communities to the predominant one?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, there's a romance, the idea of the West in general, maybe not necessarily even just the Pacific Northwest, but there's the romance of gathering up your kin and your community and making that trek across the wilds and setting up in the land of milk and honey. And I think that I mean, I find that romantic. And I lived here. I live here and grew up here. It really does feel like a land of many possibilities. And I think that the idea of it being in peril or being in, when you're in a city like Portland or Seattle or San Francisco now, where there are housing crises and people are, say, moving from California to Portland because they can buy a house here and they can't buy one in the Bay or whatever, and you get this territorial anger from the people who are already here, of just like, no, I was here first, and of course the argument goes like, unless you were a Native American, you were not here first, and
right.
and but that kind of I think that anger is stirred up because of this place and because of that romance, and that everyone has that kind of romance of the Northwest, everyone who comes here maybe, that they can carve out their own little space, and it can be perfect. They could make it perfect in their own way. And I think that's why people get so defensive and riled up about it. And I definitely was thinking about that with the island. I mean, it's a fantasy. Who wouldn't just jump at the chance to go to their own island in the San Juans and just set up their own community.
Yeah. No, I wonder if, to push that even further, if there's a flavor to the literature, maybe in the Pacific Northwest or at least in the West, around imagined futures or alternate presents, in the sense that there seems to be a rise of bioregional dystopian climate change novels. So Eden Lepucki's California, and then Claire V. Watkins' book. But the ones, and I haven't read either of those, so I'm not sure if they fall as similar to this or different, but similar to Marrow Island, other Pacific Northwest writers, and I think of Ben Parziebach, Sherwood Nation, who I've had on the show and who's interviewed you, which also puts the emphasis on what to do afterwards. But then also Ursula Le Guin, another Portland writer, and Neil Stevenson in Seattle. It seems like there's an emphasis on how to create utopia out of dystopia, rather than just a pure dystopian novel. They're not novels that are about catastrophe as much as they seem to be about human ingenuity in the face of the catastrophe. And I wondered if you felt like a kinship to regional writers in that sense.
Absolutely. I think that's a great observation. I don't know that I ever quite connected. I mean, obviously, I feel a kinship with Ben's book, but yeah, I think that's a great observation. I definitely do. I feel like a regional writer. I'm really proud to be a regional writer, and I don't know how to write something in which the landscape does not play a huge role. And I think that is probably what is true with a lot of us, is that we're humans, but we're tied to this landscape and we love it. And we want to be able to be responsible humans, I guess, and maybe model that for the people who move here, who aren't, they're awed by this landscape, but they don't necessarily get it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's have our listeners hear some of the prose from Marrow Island. Okay.
So one of the things we didn't talk about or haven't talked about yet is that the book is told in alternating chapters. You know from the get-go that something went awry on Marrow Island with Lucy, and she's sort of recalling what happened, and then also we're jumping ahead to the future from the place from which she is recalling this in the Malheur National Forest, where she has taken up with a park ranger, and she's in the woods, and she's supposed to be writing about her experience, and she's sort of maybe not altogether with it, and you don't really know why until the end. But yeah, so I'll read a little section from the Malheur chapters.
Great.
If that's okay. I'm taking the old mining road to the lake today. I leave a note that says, "I'll be home soon," on the kitchen table. There's only one note. I just keep leaving it over and over again, then pocketing it as soon as I get back. I always make it back before he finds it. It's on the table today, just in case. If something happened to me out there, Carrie would find a crumpled, weathered piece of my notebook paper with deep crease lines from the folding and unfolding. He would hold it in his hands, carefully, barely touching it like a suicide note. If I didn't come back, he would be the one in charge of finding me. I witnessed a rescue in my first days here. A cross-country skier who didn't report back. Dogs, helicopter, volunteers in the snow with whistles. They let me volunteer, though I didn't have the training. I learned as we went. It was the most exciting thing that happened all spring, the prospect of coming across a mauled, frozen outdoorsman. That was how Carrie prepared me for the worst. Could have been a lynx, he said. I thought about this and concluded that I would always root for the lynx. But the guy was just lost. He had a dozen protein bars and some energy matches on him. He melted snow for water. He seemed irritated that it took us so long. Then the snow was gone earlier than usual. There weren't as many hard freezes, and the snowfall averages all around the state were low, despite the late season fall. When the pack isn't as deep, it can melt completely in just a few warmer than average days. Spring arrived suddenly. Now everything is blooming and hatching. The conversation around the ranger station is all almanac all the time. Mosquito year, black fly year, drought year, fire year.
Been listening to Alexis M. Smith read from her latest novel, Marrow Island. You've mentioned the influence of Margaret Atwood for you in general as a writer, but specifically around this book, her novel Surfacing. Can you talk about both how this novel is in conversation with Surfacing, if it is, and your general sense of influence that you get from outlet?
Yeah. I mean, I just, on a very early stage in my life, I read The Handmaid's Tale when I was 13, because I read in Sassy Magazine that if you're a feminist, then you have to read The Handmaid's Tale. And so I went down to the Seattle Public Library and I checked out a copy, and it blew my little mind. And I was sort of hooked on her ever since. And I think that what really drew me into The Handmaid's Tale, aside from the fact that it's a great dystopian story, and probably the very first dystopian story I'd ever read, was that she was Canadian and I was an Alaskan. I grew up in Alaska, and there was a sense when I was, growing up in Alaska that, like, Alaskans don't become writers. And I remember reading an interview with Margaret Atwood that said something to the same effect. She was like, Canadians didn't become writers. It was New Yorkers. It was, maybe you were from Los Angeles, but no, you had to be from New York or go to New York to become a writer. And she was a Canadian, and she still lived in Canada, and she wrote about the landscape up there, and that was sort of my initial connection to her. It wasn't necessarily The Handmaid's Tale and the fact that I was a feminist, but just that knowing that she had done all of this. She had written all of these books, and people read them and knew about them. So Surfacing, I read a bit later. I think I was in my early 20s the first time I read it. And it grabbed my imagination for some of those reasons, that it's the Canadian landscape. It's a woman in the wilderness story. It's, it's somewhat a relationship with a missing father story, which I think both of my books sort of touch on, even though my father is always in my life and has been a great influence on me. But there's the sense of a missing parent, and going back to where you're from and seeking a connection to it, and the landscape, and just that relationship with the landscape. And Surfacing it's a story about a woman whose father has been sort of living off the grid on this lake in, I think, somewhere in Quebec. And she's received word that he's gone. He's not at his cabin when his supplies come. And so she goes with a couple of her boyfriend and a couple friends out there to find out what has happened to her dad. And she's also just sort of slowly psychologically falling apart out in the woods. And she's gone back to sort of seek connection, and what she's really found is much deeper. And you learn some things that I don't want to reveal in case people are going to read it. But that was a huge influence on Marrow Island. It was very much a woman in the wilderness book. It's what happens when you're alone with a landscape, what happens when you're in close contact with a landscape that means a lot to you, that maybe doesn't treat you the way that you imagine it should treat you. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I would say that those are the big influences from.
You've written a little bit about the female psyche and it being
like a wilderness,
equated in literature,
right. Mm-hmm.
like the wilderness,
yeah.
like an untamed wilderness,
exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that the female psyche, like the natural world, has been subjected to the male gaze mm-hmm. in literature right. and otherwise, mm-hmm. bent on colonization and mm-hmm. exploitation.
Yeah.
So do any books come to mind? And I guess Surfacing is probably one of them, that explore the non-human world and the female psyche in a way that avoids doing that?
I think that definitely Surfacing. I think when the protagonist is a woman who has agency and makes choices, whether they're good or bad, it is less likely to fall into that trap of, like, this is just a woman going crazy. She's just like the wilderness, and she's never going to do what you expect. And I think there's also something really empowering about that connection, though, that if you are inscrutable to the male gaze, there is some power in that. Like, that maybe you cannot be penetrated or colonized in the ways that that patriarchy is attempting.
Yeah.
And I think about books like one of my favorite books that's out of print now is O Caledonia by this woman Elspeth Barker, who is Scottish. It's about a post-war Scotland and a young woman and her growing up. And you know from the beginning that she dies in kind of a horrible way in the story, and it's her life story up to age 16 when she dies. But she is just this kooky, obsessed with books girl who is always out in the wilds of Scotland, outside her family estate, just becoming weirder and weirder the more she interacts. Like she ends up with is it a crow? I can't remember. She gets a wild bird pet who just like hangs on her, and after she dies, the crow is like kills itself by like slamming itself against the window of her bedroom or something like that. And it's I think about that book because it's just crazy. I mean, there's no logic to it, to her relationship with the moors and the crazy wilderness outside of her family estate, and she just subverts expectations of her family and society all the time. Let's see if I can think of any others. Tove Jansson has a great book, or Jansson. I don't speak Swedish or Norwegian, so I don't know how to say it. But she has a great book called True Deceiver, which is about a couple of women who form a strange relationship in a rural town in Finland. And it's another book where women it's their relationships with the world at large, the natural world at large, are so unique and so specific to them that they cannot be explained to those around them. And so they become these elusive characters who, one is called a witch and the other is sort of venerated as a kind of nature-loving illustrator of children's books. But she is just kooky in her own way. And so I think about books like that, and I recommend those books highly.
Well, I really loved about, similarly with Marrow Island, the plot is moved forward mainly by women. They have women have. I mean, not that there aren't men with agency in the book, but the scenarios are mostly centered around some significant women in the book. But also, I really liked how Lucy's bisexuality was just very matter of fact in the book. I mean, if you would call it that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I would say she's bisexual.
Yeah,
for sure.
That it's just a detail of. I really appreciated the way it was just part of the fabric of the world that you painted.
I mean, that was intentional. It's at this point I could reveal this, but Isabel in Glaciers was bisexual too. And there was originally a chapter that talked about a relationship she had with a woman, and it was very it had nothing to do with the story with her and Spoke, and it had nothing to do really with anything. It was just a memory that was there that was integral to her character, but my editor, and not maliciously, and I don't think at all for homophobic reasons, challenged me to explain it, or to explain her bisexuality in some way. And I said, I don't, I think at the time, being a younger writer who hadn't published before, I said, well, I don't want to, but I'll just take out the chapter then, because I just... it's like, I don't want to have to explain it. It's a thing that happens in the world. Why can't it just be? And I think if I had put my foot down and been like, no, I'm just not going to, then it would have been fine. Yeah. But at the time I ended up taking the chapter out, perhaps for other reasons too. But yeah, I mean, this time around it was very much like, she's just going to be bisexual. That's the way it's going to be. And her attraction and love for Katie is going to be, as real as her attraction to Carrie.
Right.
Yeah.
We're talking today to Alexis M. Smith, the author of Marrow Island. Well, one of the powerful women you mentioned is the ex-sister, Sister Janet, who is the leader, charismatic leader of Marrow Island. And in one interview, you were asked whether religion was important to the book, and your answer was not religion, but spiritual accountability. And I was wondering if you could talk about what that means to you, spiritual accountability and in relationship to Marrow Island.
Sure. I wasn't, my parents are not religious. They were sort of hippies, and they were Baha'i for a while, and they were, I went to church with friends sometimes as a kid, but then I ended up in Catholic school sort of randomly. And so I got this really interesting view into Catholicism and to the sisters who ran my high school in Seattle, the Sisters of the Holy Names. And I got a really interesting education in social justice from them. And in that while they were, against abortion, and I was very much pro-choice, they were also against the death penalty. And there was a kind of consistency to their way of thinking. And that was the kind of spirituality I wanted to approach. Not necessarily the organized religion with all of the rules and the Pope saying on high, like, this is what we think. This is what we do. It was more of that component that leads you to go out in the world and do something to make things better for other people. And I mean, that's probably part of the reason why I picked an ex-nun as the character, because she comes with all of this. She comes from a patriarchal system, and she breaks out of it to do what she really believes God wants her to do. And she doesn't expect everyone else in the colony to have that same mission from God. She just expects them to have the mission for whatever their reasons are, because they know they need to leave the planet in a better place, or because they want to get out of poverty, or whatever it is, and that their accountability to the planet that they live on is their spirituality in that way, or is their religion in that way. Like, if you're accountable to the people around you and their well-being, then why can't you be accountable to the planet and its well-being? And yeah, I mean, that's the idea I was going for.
Yeah, and I was curious about the role you see direct action or alternate economies play in spiritual accountability. We know that when you read Marrow Island, you'll discover that this community, with all its good intentions, isn't exactly following the laws of the day.
Right.
So there can be conflicts between
what's legally,
what's your vision, and also just the question of, if you believe deeply in a cause, what are you willing to do for the cause?
Right. Yeah. And I think that I wanted to come up against that, because there are things that they do that they do because they believe they're right, but though they are legally in the wrong, the society around them believes that they're wrong. And one of those things has to do with, not giving too much away, I hope, but the use of psychedelics, which are still, I believe, Schedule 3. Is that what it is?
I'm not sure.
The federal government considers psychedelics to be some of the most dangerous kinds of drugs, although, the history of the government experimenting with them is one thing, but people at large just like picking mushrooms is another, and selling them or using them. And so that's one way in which the community is sort of coming up against society at large. And I think that there are a lot of places where people need to make decisions to take direct action, and whether it's marching in the street and blocking traffic, and or it's taking over an empty lot and turning it into a garden, or planting fruit trees on public property, or whatever it is. Like, there are ways of making a point and standing up for your beliefs that are also probably technically illegal, and yeah, they do a few of those. They brush up against a lot of those things on the island.
Well, you mentioned some of the things that they're doing that aren't accepted by the society at large, and there is a mystery at the heart of Marrow Island, one unrevealed secret. But there's also, because of what Marrow Island is doing and their tenuous relationship to the mainland, perhaps Lucy coming to the island to visit her friend is a little bit fraught because she's not just coming as a friend, she's also coming as a journalist,
Right.
which seems to add another layer to this tension of her visit, because we and them can't be sure exactly what ultimately is going to come from the visit.
Right. There is I think it's fair to say it because it happens early in the book, but there's a missing resident of Orwell Island, which is the island that Lucy's family cottage was on. It's next to Marrow Island, and she has to discover his sort of connection to the colony. She knows that she finds out that they have known each other and have been in communication, and it has to do with the sort of tenuousness of their legal occupation of this parcel of land on the island. And that's coming back to sort of what we're talking about in terms of like wanting your peace. And they're technically squatting on this land and for a while have had the permission of the people who own the land sort of quietly. And that's coming into that is in danger of it. They're in danger of losing all that they have worked for. And so that sets up a sort of mystery there with this missing guy and what he has to do with it. And what was your question again?
No, that was good. Well, one of the things that I think was really uncanny when you describe this scenario with the Marrow colony is that while you're writing this book, another group in the real world is wanting to occupy land in Malheur wildlife refuge, which is a not exact setting, but a close setting to what you have for the other part of your book.
Yeah.
So the Malheur National Forest is this other part of your book that takes place after the Marrow colony event and is told and then looks back upon it. But the coincidence is uncanny to me that you're looking at different conceptions of how to steward the land. And you're writing this book that takes place in a part of Oregon that probably nobody had heard about prior to this occupation. And then very different sort of utopian conception of land takes over public land in Oregon, and it becomes news. I was just curious about your thoughts about it and whether you welcomed this intersection with the news or whether you felt like it was something that you wish wasn't intruding in the narrative of the story.
I exchanged emails with the publicist saying, like, is it sick that I am excited that people are going to know about vaguely where the Malheur is now? And she's like, no, she's like, I would be worried if you weren't a little bit excited about that, And I mean, in that sense, I was, that anytime anything is in the broader imagination, it helps, I think. Even though in my story it's in the National Forest, which is actually, I think, 100 miles or so from the refuge. But that region is right now going through a lot of sort of political turmoil regarding the public land and just into the north of there, whether or not to name, is it the Owyhee Canyon? They want to name the government wants to set it aside as not as a refuge, but as a national monument or something like that. So. And there's a lot of contention about whether or not that should happen. And so it's definitely it's a lively place for debates on uses of public land and what the rural communities actually get to say about that. The people who actually live there, and not just the tourists who come and visit or use the land, and then also with the government workers who obviously live out in those communities too, and what their role is. And in the book, I definitely. I dated a wildland firefighter. I've known people who've done park ranger work and stuff like that, and so I definitely come at that perspective as they do the best work that they can with sort of both the bureaucracy that they're working under and also the interface with the public, and that it's a really hard job, and that sometimes these crises happen where they have to sort of be more the government. They have to group. They have to become a group that is telling people what to do and how they can and cannot be with that land. And fires are a great example of that. And something that is just we're going to have more and more of in the coming years, probably. And so having a fire in the book was something that I thought. I kind of knew that there was always going to be another natural disaster in the book that was going to sort of bookend I think that it's one of those things that definitely puts into relief the relationships that people have, and that was sort of the whole point of the book was how do these relationships change when big things happen.
Well, in addition to the fondness that I have to being in the colony and experiencing their rituals, the other thing that I really admired about Marrow Island was the way you portrayed death, both in the colony, and I thought some of the more moving parts of the rituals were around death, but the way death is portrayed as part of life, and I mean that in two different ways, and I'm just curious about your thoughts about them. The first one is sort of the existential way of death is part of life,
right?
No matter what. And without mischaracterizing your book, which has a ton of young people in it also who are activists and involved in the book, there's also old people with old bodies, and we have people with dying bodies, and we have deathbed scenes, and we have taking care of people who are dying, the unglamorous acts of caretaking, scenes which seem rarely portrayed in literature, I think. There was something very refreshing to see that evoked in a book for me.
I know exactly the scenes you're talking about. I think that while I was writing this book, my grandmother was dying, and she had sort of been slowly dying of congenital heart failure for years. And it was torture for her. She was in her prime, a really lively person and a leader and the matriarch of our family, and traveled a lot and was a volunteer and did so much for her family and for the communities that she was a part of. And in some ways, Sister J is modeled on her. But I guess knowing that she was going to pass, that this was a thing that was inevitable. It was going to happen. She wasn't going to be in the world anymore. And watching her deteriorate, it made me think a lot about how we spend time with people in the end, what is important to them. It's sort of a mysterious, when you're looking at it from the outside as a younger person and you feel like death is really far away for you. It's really mysterious. What is, my grandmother couldn't articulate a lot toward the end. So it's not like I could ask her or wanted to ask her, like, what is going through your head? Like, what are you thinking about? What are you feeling existentially? Like, what is this process like? And I definitely felt like with the larger themes of the book of sort of the disasters and death and resurrection, or that process of what happens just before and just after is really, it's fascinating to me. And it's really, I think, a place where more people should be asking questions and looking. Should be. I shouldn't say should be, but I'm
I'm really glad you did. But I mean, it was really refreshing to have that looked at closely, I thought.
I'm glad.
Yeah. Well, so the other way in which the life-death situation seemed interesting to me was the way death was encroaching on life because of environmental destruction, the over-humanization of the world. Like a while ago in a different radio program, I interviewed the environmental activist and writer Sandra Steingraber, who had written a memoir about giving birth to her first child, and talked about how human breast milk was the most contaminated food on the planet because we're at the top of the food chain, bioaccumulation, and it's a fatty food, which is where toxins accumulate. And nevertheless, even with that fact, it is still the most life-sustaining food for human babies, even being the most polluted. And there's that sense of not being pull that apart in your book, the toxins and the colony almost intentionally planting itself on contaminated land. I mean, where else are you going to plant yourself to start a ideological revolution of some sort?
Right. And also the idea that this island may seem so toxic. It may seem so toxic that no one could live there, but our entire planet is suffering from this same toxicity. It's not like that island is separate from. It is part of and connected to. And so this questioning of why would they go there if they knew they were putting themselves in danger of becoming ill from the toxicity, and that question of like are they just hastening a probability that everyone else is subjected to as well? It's like, why judge that decision if what they're doing is going there to make it better? Why not let them do it?
And mushrooms, which play a big role in this book, and you mentioned the psychedelic mushrooms, but mushrooms in a larger sense play a big role in this book and seem like this perfect symbol in a way because they're decomposers and detoxifiers and immune stimulators, and also deadly poisons and bringers of visions. And they're being used by the colony and as one of the main tools. So,
I think that mushrooms really are the prime symbol because of their relationship to death. They're sort of a bridge between the two, between life and death. They bring more life from death, and the processes that mycelium go through are it's pretty incredible when you start doing research about what mycelial colonies will do in a forest, in an ecosystem. There's more research that they're helping bees avoid colony collapse and things like that. So but at the same time, yes, I mean, things have to die for them to do their thing and live, and they have the mycelium are almost like brain cells, where they send out information and they process information, and they can communicate between plants. And why can't they communicate between species? Why can't they communicate to humans as well? And so I think that was a really I think that symbol is probably my favorite and the most important for the book itself. And the islands might be symbols, or the wilderness might be a symbol, but mushrooms are definitely the most important. They're at the heart.
And their capacity to be involved in land remediation, is that based in a scientific
it is,
reality? It is.
Yes, from Paul Stamets from up in Olympia, who's written many books about mushrooms. It's where I learned about mycelial remediation, mycoremediation. It's, of course, in my book is more of a fantasy, the idea that you would deploy it sort of large scale to remediate an environment. But I mean, it feels like an imminent possibility to me. Like, why not? What harm could be done?
But also, I don't know if this stretches the metaphor, but it felt in a way like there was a parallel emotional remediation that Lucy was trying to do by going back to Marrow Island. She's trying to reclaim this uninhabitable emotional space around the death of her dad.
Yeah,
at the same time. Yeah,
absolutely.
So can you tip your hand to anything that you're working on now?
Only very vaguely, because it's still quite murky to me. I refer to it as soup sometimes, like in my brain. Sometimes it's soup, sometimes it's stew, as it's becoming more solid and real. But I think the next book is going to take on patriarchy in a bigger way than I've ever taken on in fiction. And part of that is recent events. It feels like things have really sort of, when I was a young feminist in the 90s and it was the year of the woman, and, you could go to music festivals and buy pro-choice T-shirts, and there wasn't activism so much as this almost like pop culture liberalism and pop culture feminism with Riot Girls. And now it feels like we are so far from that. Not to ignore any advances, but it feels like there's been some slippage, and this sort of malicious anti-woman and anti-gay and anti-trans, and there's a lot of sort of around gender. There's just been a lot of pain and death, and a lot of fear is coming out of it with bathroom laws, and I think a lot of it just comes down to misogyny, and I feel like I need to tackle it, and so I'm working on that.
Well, you'd mentioned with Marrow Island in other interviews that it started with a dream.
Yeah.
And so you had a sort of an image or a set of images that prompted it. And how do you find an entry point into this huge topic of confronting misogyny in your next book? Is there a entryway that is more of an image or a scenario that you start with, not to push you to reveal too much?
Yeah, I think it's definitely this time I didn't have a specific dream that sort of laid out a plot for me, but I am sort of drawn to the narratives of many different women that I know who have, whether they're in academia or the arts or they're just working class, working retail, just situations where they have come up against just completely unexpected sexism and what we do about it. And so I have some images that have come sort of out of what these women's lives are like, and I don't nothing that's concrete enough or vivid enough that I could lay it out here. It's still in that. I need to do more dreaming on it.
Yeah.
Let the images come together.
I look forward to it.
Well, thanks.
Thanks for being on Between the Covers again.
Thanks for having me again. It's always great.
We're talking today to the author, Alexis M. Smith, about her latest book, Marrow Island. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. If you enjoyed today's program, consider supporting the show by going to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And also while you're there, check out the growing archive of bonus material available. Thanks for listening.